Hey everyone, Andy Raffel from eTechnics.com. Now there's always been a long heated debate of should you buy a console, should you buy a PC? Well today I'm going to try and settle that one for you. Let's do this. The Asus TUF RX 5600 XT, a match made in heaven for those who are serious about 1080p gaming, incorporating advanced fan technology to improve airflow and silence without compromise. Each card undergoes rigorous testing and 144-hour validation to make sure it still performs to its best, even when pushed to the limit. Click the link in the description to find out more. So as I mentioned, there's always been this long heated debate of do you buy a console or do you buy a PC? Obviously, in my opinion, PC master race all day long. I've had consoles before and frankly, there's just so much more you can do with a PC. But even if you are looking at a console, do you look at buying sort of the current generation Xbox or PlayStation 4, or do you wait until the new ones come out, which just seem to, I don't know, be further and further away from one's reach? Now, the big problem there as well comes down to cost. If you're going to buy one of the latest consoles, you're going to be looking at around sort of £220 to £250 for a base console with say 500 gigs worth of storage. If you're looking at one of the new consoles, they're said to be coming out at about $500, which is going to be about £400, $450. But then really to get the most out of the console, you are going to have to sign up to one of the subscription services. So whether that be PlayStation Plus, which works out about £50 a year or $60, or Xbox Live Gold. Again, looking around the same kind of price point. Now, when we actually look at consoles and how, I guess, long they've lasted, the current generation ones have been around for about 7 to 8 years. So if we take that cost of sort of £50, across the 7 years or 8 years, you're looking at about £350 to £400. Then add that onto the cost of the console, straight away we're now up to sort of six to £700 before you've even really bought the games that you specifically want. Now I know that these subscription services come with a lot of games, but they might not have the games that you specifically want. So then you're going to have to go out and buy them, which generally speaking you're looking at around £40 to £50 or around $50 to $60 in the US. It all just adds up and adds up and adds up. So what if you could build a PC that could do 1080p gaming, because with a console you don't really get this whole 4K true representative resolution. Instead you get more of kind of an upscaled thing, which isn't perfect in the grand scheme of things. And there's no future upgradability path. And generally speaking, when you do go from console to console, it's really a bit of a kind of hit or miss as to whether they're going to add backwards compatibility. That's where a PC really does come in different. Now, you probably noticed sort of straight away that this actually does look a little bit like a console, and that was kind of my whole thinking behind it. And I've got a whole host of components here that I've put in here, and we are going to be looking at kind of how it performs in a lot of free-to-play titles, because you have to remember that there are on PC a lot of free-to-play titles. There are also a lot of kind of backwards compatible titles, if that makes sense. PCs have never really changed. While the platform itself changes in terms of CPU socket, in terms of what memory it supports, DDR4 compared to DDR3 compared to DDR2 and backwards, the games themselves will run on everything from 20, 30 years ago all the way up until the current day. So you've got to remember that you have this huge back catalogue of things. Now I want to talk through the components and specifically why I chose them, what the total cost was and so forth. Now looking at kind of the whole bundle, you are going to be looking at about £391 at the current time of filming, or around $519 in the US for all of the components that you see here. But you do get, like I say, a future upgradability path. So you probably notice that there isn't a GPU here, but you can always add one at a later date. Now talking about sort of GPU, that's where the CPU actually comes in, or more specifically the APU. So this is the Ryzen 5 2400G. We could have gone with the third generation, but because of the third generation now coming out, you can actually pick these up pretty damn cheap. So pricing wise, you're going to find this is going to come in at about £119 in the UK. Essentially what you have is a 4-core 8-thread processor operating at speeds of 3.6 GHz that can boost up to 3.9 GHz. It has got Vega kind of graphics in there, so it's the Vega 11, and this means that we are going to be able to play certain games on, let's say, modest settings at 1080p. So we're going to be talking about Fortnite, we're going to be talking about Minecraft, Apex Legends, League of Legends, and so forth. All of these games are free to play, and in my opinion, just give you that extra value that you're going to get with a PC compared to a console. Yes, some of these games are free on console, but not all of them. And you have to also remember that we have got things like the Humble Bundle, or you've got friends who can gift you games across a variety of different software platforms like Steam. And basically that just adds, in my opinion, extra value. Now to house this processor, this APU, we are going to need a motherboard, and we decided to go for the ASRock AB350M Pro 4. It's a micro ATX motherboard that fits nicely inside this chassis, and it does give us some future upgradability. So if you wanted to upgrade the APU to maybe a higher end processor, if you end up getting a GPU at a later date, you have that ability. If you wanted to add a GPU, you can do that because you do have a PCI Express X16 lane. You also have the ability to upgrade your storage options. So adding a M.2 or maybe even two M.2s. It has USB Type-C and it's pretty damn affordable. At around £62 or $85 in the US, I honestly don't think that you're going to find a better motherboard out there. Yes, it's the B350 platform, but to be honest, for this kind of budget, you don't really need anything above and beyond that. Now, to get the most out of the APU platform, you actually are going to need quite a lot of memory. So we did actually run some preliminary check. So we've gone with two Corsair modules. These are the Vengeance LPX. So they're both 8GB modules and they operate at speeds of 3000 megahertz, giving us 16GB in total, operating, as I say, in dual channel mode. That really allows this processor or this APU to kind of stretch its legs in both processor intensive tasks as well as really utilizing throwing as much memory as we physically can at that APU, and at least on the Vega side of it. You have to remember, if we had a graphics card, then yes, we'd be looking at having something with 4GB of GDDR5 or GDDR6 memory, or 6GB or 8GB. Basically, you need to try and kind of utilize having a certain amount of memory for your processor tasks and a certain amount of memory for the GPU related tasks. So that's exactly why we've gone with 16GB. Just the increase that you get by having 16GB over 8GB is obviously quite abundant. And then having that ability of going from single channel to dual channel really does sort of give the APU something to bite its teeth into. In terms of the pricing on this memory, it's actually probably the most affordable out there. I did scour the internet and yes, you can find a few deals here and there, but Corsair typically are the ones who come out the cheapest for kind of sustained pricing. So these actually come in for both modules. You could buy it in a dual channel kit. I actually ended up getting it in two single channel kits because I wanted to try one first and then realized that I needed the other. But you're going to be looking at around £70 in the UK or $80 in the US, which is pretty damn affordable, even if you're not going to be using it for a rig like this and you just want some 3000 megahertz memory. Now, when it comes to the storage, we had a few choices. We could have gone with a single large hard drive. And at first I did actually look at a WD Blue 1TB hard drive, which came in at around 35 to 40 pounds, around $50 in the US. But instead I decided to plump for a single 500GB WD Blue SATA SSD. Priced at about £58 in the UK or $65 in the US, I honestly believe that this is going to be the better one. Yes, you're not going to be able to install as many games as you would on a 1TB hard drive, but you could always add a hard drive at a later date. You know, I mean, if I was a kid, which I think this is primarily going to be aimed at sort of, you know, the younger generation, and maybe your parents were going to buy you a PC for Christmas or for a birthday, then they could buy you this, and then there's nothing stopping sort of, you know, grandparents or someone adding in a few things at a later date, or even getting you a hard drive as part of that birthday present, something along them lines, or even just save up your money and buy one. You're not going to be looking at a huge amount of sort of money difference. But going for an SSD, it's going to be night and day difference in terms of load speeds of even just getting into Windows and then actually getting into sort of games themselves and the load times. So we have all of that. Now, to power all this, obviously we are going to need a power supply that is beefy enough to handle it. And that's where the Corsair SF450 comes in. So it is a 450 watt power supply, but you've got to remember, we don't really have a huge amount of components that are going to be draining the power. So 450 is actually more than enough. The amount of times I see people kind of using 1000 watt power supplies, it's just complete overkill. Now, the beauty of the SF450 is the fact that it is actually 80 plus platinum. That means the efficiency rating on this is amazing. Just to give you a really quick rundown of that, power coming from the wall versus power what's actually being delivered to the PC, and the loss of power in between. This hasn't really got a great deal of it. So really, really great there. It does have all of the cables and connections for, again, that kind of upgrade path of adding in a GPU or adding in extra drives at a later date. Now, because it is an SFX power supply compared to an ATX power supply, it is going to be, I guess, a little bit more expensive. You actually pay a premium for going smaller. If you wanted to change the case to a ATX case and have an ATX power supply, yes, you do have that option. But I wanted to make something that kind of resembled, I guess, the shape and size of a console. Now, when I am talking about pricing on the SF450, you are going to be looking at about $78.99 in the UK and $107 in the US. Which, like I say, yes, it is a little bit on the expensive side compared to an ATX power supply, but honestly, I don't think you're actually going to find an 80 plus platinum power supply much cheaper even in an ATX form factor. And the fact that this is fully modular as well, with a case like this, which is pretty small form factor in the grand scheme of things, you are going to have sort of the ability to cable management a little bit better than what you would with something with unnecessary undue cables. Now, to house all of these amazing components, obviously we needed a case that would fit the bill. And that's where we went with the Aerocool Player Slim. I guess a few different reasons. One, I wanted it to look like a console, and I think it definitely has that, especially with this front panel. It does also have the ability to add in a drive at a later date if you did actually want to use CDs and DVDs and things like that. Honestly, I don't think you're going to need to, but to be honest, I don't think there's a better chassis out there for the same kind of price in this form factor. So you are looking at, like I say, having this console-esque look to it, and it has got RGB, and as we all know, RGB makes everything look a million times better. It does come with a very, very small exhaust fan in there, and to be honest, there's actually quite a lot of room in there considering sort of, you know, some of the components that we've put in there. Obviously, you could add maybe a slightly beefier CPU cooler, but to be honest, the one that comes with the Ryzen 5 2400G is pretty sort of fit for the bill anyway. So there's the PC in general, going through all the prices, going through all the sort of specs and everything, but really it's all down to the performance. Now, I'm probably hazarding a guess that this video is going to come out quite long, so let's jump into it and sort of look at, I guess, how things are actually going to perform in quite a few different titles. So everything from sort of Fortnite to Apex Legends and everything in between. So first game, League of Legends. So I just want to quickly go through the settings. Straight away you can see that we're at 1920 by 1080 and everything is actually set to the maximum, so very high. We do have a frame rate cap of 240, but we'll stick that to uncapped, and vertical sync is obviously off. Now up here you can see the FPS, so let's get into a bit of a battle where it's going to be the most intensive and see what we get. Okay, so we're in a battle and you can see straight away that we are getting sort of 105, 106 frames per second. I wanted to do League of Legends first purely because I knew that it wouldn't be, let's say, the most intensive of games. I've never actually played League of Legends myself, so it's interesting. And yeah, looks like I died. So there you go, next game. So video settings for Apex before we actually get started. So you can see that we are at 1920 by 1080. VSync is obviously disabled. So adaptive resolution, this is quite an important one. We've actually set this to 60. So what it will do is it will lower things and basically try and make the game as smooth as possible to get around that 60 FPS target. Other than that, yes, we have got pretty much everything on its lowest. So bilinear on the texture filtering, low on sun shadow detail, volumetric lighting disabled, but we have got a few things here. So model detail and effects detail set to medium. So really with this, you could play about with it a little bit and maybe even increase that FPS target, or even come down a little bit on the resolution from 1920 by 1080 to maybe even 1600 by 900 to see what kind of works for you. But let's see what kind of FPS we're able to get. So we're getting sort of 60 FPS. I have got someone near me. I haven't actually played Apex in quite a while, so let's try and cut them off from the other side. It's the only problem whenever I do games and I want to actually show Apex, I end up getting so engrossed in the game that I forget about kind of what I was talking about, which is FPS. But we are at 58 frames per second. We have put the target in to get us as close to 60 as possible. So either way, when I'm getting shot on the floor, I'm at 55, 57 frames per second. So pretty decent numbers overall, based on the settings that we're getting, and definitely just a visual improvement over what Apex looks like on a console. Okay, so the necessary evil when you're doing a kind of console killer build, Fortnite. This is going to be the one that I guess a lot of people, this is actually going to appeal to. So there's different ways that you can do this, and I have played about just a little bit with some of the settings. So straight away, we're at 1920 by 1080. The quality, it did actually auto set it to high, or very high. We've actually turned it down to low, but we have put the 3D resolution up, because normally when you choose low, it'll actually put it down to like 33%. That means that instead of rendering at 1920 by 1080, it's actually rendering at a lower resolution. But I want it to render at a higher one. I have played about, and really it's down to personal preference. You could drop this down to say 80%, and then you could actually put the rest of the quality presets up one level and kind of decide which one you think looks better. We have got obviously VSync turned off, and we are in DirectX 11 mode. There is the choice of going on to DirectX 12 beta, but it's entirely up to you. I've had problems with it in the past. But let's get into a game and see exactly how it looks. So we're in the game, we're at 53 frames per second. So yeah, I mean, things look pretty decent, I want to say. Like I say, you could adjust the graphics quality settings and things like that, and you know, maybe decrease that render resolution just to get something a bit different. But I'm not actually fighting against anyone, but I just want to show what it's like when there is a bit of gunfire and some other stuff kind of going on. You can still see that we're getting 45 to sort of 60 frames per second. So pretty decent numbers really for a game that's that popular. As we're about to sort of dive out of the sky, you will see number again, sort of 67 frames per second. And as we're actually diving, it does drop down a little bit to sort of 35 to 42 frames per second. But these are still very respectable, very playable numbers. A lot of people kind of want to go for that 60 FPS magic number, but for the most part, 30 frames per second and above is more than kind of what you need. So yeah, pretty happy with that and pretty happy with the way that the actual game looks in general. I'm not a massive fan of Fortnite, so I want to get off this game as quickly as possible and get into the next one. So next game, CSGO. Obviously a firm favourite, has been for many, many years of a lot of people. Straight away again, 1920 by 1080. It's actually auto done all of our graphics settings to high. So I'm not going to touch anything because if it thinks that that's good enough, then, you know, we can kind of go with that and see what we get. You see that a few things are actually on very high. It's not the most demanding of games, but let's get into it and see what we can do. So we're in game, straight away we can see up here sort of 66, 67 FPS. I am playing against bots just because why not? I'm not a massive gamer myself, so yeah, this is kind of where we're at. And we can see actually trying to play a game and read out the FPS at the same time is never easy, but we're at 74, 64. So yeah, we're getting decent numbers on these frame rates. 77 frames per second, and I'm pretty sure we got all of the terrorists. Did we get all the terrorists? I even got an achievement unlocked, so yeah. There you go, guys. That is CSGO. Pretty decent numbers. Apparently we're jumping into another one now. And again, I haven't really seen it drop below 60 FPS, so pretty happy with the numbers overall. On a system that hasn't even got a graphics card in it, so I can't see why anyone would be upset by these numbers. So last game that we're going to be testing is Destiny 2. Probably out of all of the games that we've been testing along with Apex is probably, I guess, the game that is going to utilize the most resources. So sadly we have got to dial down quite a lot of the settings. So again, we're at 1920 by 1080. We have no frame rate cap or anything on here. VSync is obviously turned off, but as we go down we have set everything to low, off. There's certain things that even though you are on low, the lowest of that is actually medium. And then we've set the render resolution just slightly down to 70%, just purely because of kind of how intensive this game is. So let's get into the game and see what kind of frame rate we get. So let's see what happens as we shoot. So we're actually getting 50 frames per second while in the middle of sort of gunfight, which isn't too bad. So, I mean, if you're happy with dropping them FPS down a little bit, then in theory you could actually maybe play about with them settings just a little bit and get something, I don't know, a little bit more acceptable. But graphically, I mean, for a world that is kind of this open, I'm actually pleasantly surprised by kind of how detailed everything looks, even on low settings. Just the quality of the leaves and the reflections on the water. Admittedly, there isn't a huge amount of reflections, but to be honest, for the settings that we're running, pretty impressed with this. So there we have it. You could see that in a variety of different games, it actually performed pretty damn decently. So I wanted to make sure that the games that we chose were kind of a broad spectrum of different types of games. So we had our Battle Royale, we had kind of, you know, the RPG-esque games. League of Legends, I mean, admittedly, is going to run pretty much on a potato. But games like Apex Legends and then Destiny 2 were actually pretty intensive games. Obviously, Fortnite is kind of somewhere over there. Not a massive fan of Fortnite. It just seems like a cheap man's version of Apex Legends, if you ask me. But I do get the mantra behind it and everything, but it just goes to show that you could play these games on a system like this and for it to still look relatively decent. Like I say, in some of the games you could actually reduce the resolution down from 1920 by 1080 to say 1600 by 900. I don't think you're really going to notice too much of a difference apart from maybe in the depth of field settings. But again, in certain games you could actually change that and play around with it just a little bit. In games like Fortnite, I did find that a lot of it's going to come down to personal preference. You could either reduce that render resolution and increase the quality settings, or decrease the quality settings and up the render resolution. Again, it's going to be one of them things that I guess you guys really have to look at yourselves and just decide what you think looks honestly better for your sort of chosen way of actually playing games, really. There you go. And the fact that you do get the ability to upgrade this at a later date. So if you're not happy with the way that things are going with your system, you always have the ability to, you know, put a graphics card in there. We already have a pretty decent SSD in there, so maybe you could add a little bit of extra storage at a later date if you wanted to play sort of a multitude of different games and have them all installed at once. But if you have got a fast internet connection, then really you're not going to have a problem just downloading them as and when you need to. But with certain games coming out, like the likes of Call of Duty, which even with its updates is somewhere over sort of 200 gig in size, maybe that's not always going to be a viable option. There you go, guys. Let me know in the comment section below what you think. Would you kind of be more inclined to go down that console route and end up paying more for the system and the games that you want overall? Or would you rather go down the kind of PC master race route and have something that has the ability to be upgraded, doesn't cost you on a year-by-year basis, and for the most part, like I mentioned earlier, you do have things like Humble Bundle. There are sales going on. I'm not saying that you don't get that on the console, but I just feel that it seems a little bit more prevalent on the PC form factor. And I guess the key important one for anyone who's listening to this who maybe lives at home with parents and, you know, I guess isn't an adult, I've got a really, really good tip for you. You could actually tell your parents that you can do your homework on this. Can't really do that on a console. So maybe that's a way to get around that whole thing. Definitely keep that in mind. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, you know exactly what to do, and I will see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.